Hello, welcome to this event. My name is Vít Novotný. I'm a senior research officer at the Martin Center, and I'll be your moderator. Before introducing our speakers, I will briefly outline the focus of our event on the dilemmas in the EU's external funding. The European Union funds a number of activities in our neighborhood. One example is the new Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, NDICI or NDC. This fund represents a merger of existing funding streams in areas such as development aid, good governance, democracy, rule of law, human rights, but also migration and environment and climate change. Other important examples of EU external funding include funding for refugees in Turkey, as well as trust funds of the European Union, one for Syrian refugees in the Middle East, another one which is called the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. Looking at intentions behind all this funding, we get a highly varied picture, a different set of objectives. And I think there are two dilemmas when we look at all these intentions. One is the following. The EU spends a lot of resources on non-democratic regimes and sometimes even failed states with the goal to stem irregular migration. This money goes to governments which sometimes oppress their own citizens. Does this undermine the EU's effort to foster democratic institutions in our neighborhood? The other aspect of the same question is as follows. Does the same European funding perhaps help us save democracy at home by preventing a repeat of such developments as was the 2015-16 refugee crisis and its political aftermath? Well, that's the first dilemma. Funding for autocrats, which perhaps may or may not help us save democracy at home. And this is what I want to discuss. The second dilemma is as follows. A lot has been said about migration-related conditionality in the provision of development aid. Isn't it a good idea to oblige countries that receive EU development aid to accept repatriations of their own nationals and sometimes prevent irregular migrant departures from their territories? That's our second dilemma. To discuss these questions, I'd like to introduce our speakers. In alphabetical order, Ken Godfrey is the Executive Director of the European Partnership for Democracy, which is a support network bringing together 16 NGOs that advocate for rule of law, human rights, and good governance. Georgios Koumoutsakos is a member of the Greek Parliament for the Nea Demokratia Party and former Deputy Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy. Finally, Thomas Tobé is a member of the European Parliament for the Swedish party Moderaterna. He is chairman of the Parliament's Committee on Development. In this capacity, he also co-chairs the Democracy Support and Election Coordination Group, which oversees the Parliament's election observation missions. Our event is scheduled to take 60 minutes. You, our participants, can ask questions to our speakers. Please do so by posting your questions in the comment section on the Facebook page where you are now watching this discussion. You can start posting your questions now. After the event, please also give us feedback in the same comment section. I would now like to ask each of our three speakers to provide initial remarks in which please limit yourself to 5 minutes so that we have the scope for debate. And I would like to ask first Mr. Tobé to take the stage and provide your initial remarks. The screen is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to you all, and welcome all that you are listening to this very interesting seminar. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be with you here today. I personally believe that, migration is, of course, a very sensitive topic, politically speaking, but I would also say that it is not only a sensitive question, it's also a very important question. It is important for Europe, but it is, of course, important for our citizens, and it is, of course, important for the migrants. And we need to move forward and find more political solutions together. And that is one of the reasons why myself, I ran and got elected to the European Parliament, because I really do think that we need to have changes when it comes to the European policies. And that means both in the question of migration policy, but also when it comes to the effects on other policy areas. I do believe that migration is not something new. It always has and always will be part of our societies. But I also must say that I don't think that migration is not always the permanent solution to injustice or problems that we have in the world. And we need now to focus also more on the need to address the root causes of migration. If we look at the facts, 6 out of 10 asylum applications in Europe are rejected. As such, the majority of arrivals to the European Union are mostly economic migrants. And I do think that if we are to be able to find a system where we can protect and have a functioning common European asylum system, where we can protect the right to asylum, these numbers of economic migrants needs to be reduced. The right to asylum ultimately rests in the legitimacy among the broad public. I believe a large majority of European citizens want to give protection to refugees fleeing war, fleeing prosecution. With this said, I also believe that the current high numbers of economic migrants taking advantage of the right to asylum undermines the system also among the public. I think it's very easy to understand that there might be different reasons why you want to leave and why you want to come to Europe. But I really do think that we need to find a better way to see that we have refugees that need asylum in Europe, and then we have economic migrants that are also coming to Europe. The difference in approach and the difference in policy is something that we need to discuss. Not easy, of course not, but it's something that we need to talk more openly and try to do it in a calm way. I don't think that we should understate that the European Union is the largest economy still in the world, and the member states have strong economies, but the resources are, of course, not endless. Priorities must be made. I make no excuse of wanting to prioritize refugees before economic migrants in our asylum system. I think that is what we need to do now at the European level. And let's not forget that the vast majority of displaced people do not even set foot on European ground, but are in their country of origin or in neighboring countries. To give you an example, according to UNHCR, 6.6 million Syrian citizens are displaced, of which 5.4 million are in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq. The Commission highlights in the new pact on asylum and migration that the EU-Turkey deal continues to respond to essential needs of millions of refugees in Turkey. I would say it is essential that EU funding continue. The EU-Turkey deal have, as we all know, several shortcomings, but the assistance it provides for the migrants in Turkey is vital for their livelihood. I do not underestimate the troubling aspects of the EU-Turkey deal. Turkey is, from my opinion, not currently a functioning democracy, and Mr. Erdogan have acted in a threatening way towards the EU and also individual member states. And of course, we all need to have solidarity, for example, with Greece, whenever you see these kind of actions from Mr. Erdogan. But I'm still convinced that we have to accept that Turkey is still a neighbor to Europe, and that's why we need to deal with them. Finally, I believe that the EU now must look forward, try to find more partnerships with third countries in our neighborhood and in the neighborhood of countries of origin. We can support migrants in third countries. Let us be honest, we will help far more displaced people in third countries than we will do on European territories. This requires a close cooperation with our third country partners, together on joint objectives to eradicate poverty, reduce vulnerability to climate change, develop economic and trade policies, and supporting good governance and democratic development. We help to combat the injustices of the world while also addressing the root causes of migration. It is not a conflict between migration management and common interest on sustainable development. I think these common objectives can be achieved in a spirit of cooperation and true partnership, acting in a way that is in conflict with European values and interests shall though have consequences. One example is to withdraw development aid to such third countries. In principle, this is similar to having a rule of law conditionality in the EU long-term budget. It's the same kind of discussion. And of course, this is not a cure that will solve every problem, but it is a tool that we need at European level. I firmly believe that every euro spent must have the highest level of efficiency and align to the interests and values of the European Union and its citizens. We cannot continue to allow for unstable numbers of economic migrants seeking their way to the European Union. The most efficient way to reduce the number of arrivals is to reduce the underlying need to migration. If we are to address the root causes of migration, we must also act. The EU is the world's largest donor of development aid. This is, of course, and it gives us the financial and political strength to make a real difference for affected people in third countries. The external dimension of migration must be taken into account in the EU funding schemes. There's one thing with humanitarian aid, another thing with development assistance and aid. I'm therefore pleased that we now have a majority in the European Parliament that are pushing for that we also can talk about conditionality, because it is not only important, I would say, when it comes to the question of migration. It is equally important when it comes to governance, when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to combat climate change. This is the reality of the new world, and I think it is important for us to keep working on this. I will conclude by hoping that I was a bit provocative in my introduction, because I really do think that we need to start discussing this and trying to find solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you for your openness, Mr. Tobin, for your initial remarks. I would like to ask every speaker who's not speaking at the moment, please mute yourself. It's important for the transmission to go smoothly. Now, Mr. Koumoutsakos, the floor is yours. Again, if you limit yourself to 5 minutes, please, that would be welcome.
Thank you. I want to congratulate you and thank you for organizing this very timely and well-focused event on a very delicate, sensitive and serious issue like the external funding when it comes to migration. Before touching upon the specifics of the issue that we are discussing, let us remind to ourselves and to our audience the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that and this is something that we need to repeat, that Europe is a leading global player and a very reliable partner in the international scene, a committed supporter of multilateralism with clear-cut priorities: stability, peace, good neighbor relations, democracy, human rights, inclusive and sustainable growth. So these are our leading principles, and this is the framework within which we need to operate in all our actions. And it is important what it was said, that we remain as European member countries the biggest donor in the world of development assistance and among the first global trading partners and foreign investors. So we can say that when it comes to development assistance, Europe is the hardest soft power in the world. And this is important always to remember, because this shows our leverage and our possibilities to influence policies of third countries, of partner countries, when it comes to sensitive issues like the one we are discussing today, which is migration. Let us not question the fact that Europe is and will remain a huge, attractive region for migration. We are relatively wealthy comparing to other regions of the world, in particular those neighboring our continent. We are aging as a continent. We have we are suffering a demographic decline. And on the other hand, we are stable, democratic communities without crisis, without frictions, without wars. So we are a very attractive, the most attractive place in the globe for somebody to live in. So our success constitutes a huge pull factor for migration. And this is something that we need to come at grips with. So the migration phenomenon, I'm not using the word or the term problem, because problems have solutions. The phenomena do not have solutions. So the migration phenomenon is something that we will be dealing with for the years to come. That's why we have to shape our migration and asylum policy in a very coherent, global and far-reaching way. Having said that, I cannot but welcome the fact that 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, the Commission and the Parliament and the Council managed to agree on the Neighbourhood Development in International Cooperation Instrument, almost 80 billion euros, 79.5, which is a very strong and flexible instrument for external action. So this is a positive development. We have in our hands for the period to come an instrument, a tool that we need to use wisely in order to get our to reach our goals. When it comes in specific to migration, and trying to answer your two very important political dilemmas, I wanted to underline the following. When it comes to the first dilemma, should we fund autocratic regimes to deal within their territory with the migration problem? This is a very fundamental question that touches upon our fundamental principles of rights. And the answer is at the same time very simple and very complicated. The answer is a big capital C. That means that goes for conditionality. But conditionality should be at the same time realistically organized and framed. Because conditionality that, because of its complexity or because of its flexibility, will never be fully implemented, will not produce the results that we are looking for. So you need a system of well-framed prerequisites in order to form a conditionality that is effective. Of course, we cannot give funding to autocratic regimes like blank checks. This is not acceptable. It goes against our own fundamental values. That's why we need to put a lot of effort to create effective system and catalog and list of an effective conditionality. And of course, one of the most important things is that this fund should be based on a fundamental principle, that is, if we could transfer this money, not necessarily through the government, but through other organizations which are more reliable to autocratic government, this is a way to follow. And this is in general terms, my answer to your first dilemma. And the answer is a huge C, conditionality, but well framed. When it comes to your question, to the second dilemma, should we have incentives and counter-incentives of economic development based on the effectiveness of the migration policy of the countries that are our partners, of the third countries? It's very difficult to make a final decision because it might sound very unfair to link development assistance to an effective migration policy of the third country, for instance, like Afghanistan. On the other hand, if we don't link economic development aid with migration policy effectiveness of the third country, we are risking to create additional problems to our own citizens. I think that, once again, what we need is a well-stricken balance between incentives and counter-incentives. We need both. And the system of development aid should be based on the principle M2M. More, MFM, more for more. More funding, more cooperation. When it comes to Turkey, I do agree that we should positively consider the possibility of funding Turkey in order to come to grips to the migration challenge that this country is faced with. 4 million refugees and migrants is a huge number, and we have to admit it. Though we need to consider the funding or the continuation of the funding, because 6 billion have been already allocated. The first tranche has already been given to Turkey, and now we have the second period, the second tranche. I think that what is important is to link this funding with the obligation that Turkey has accepted in its agreement with EU back in 2016, which is to eradicate the smugglers' networks and to prevent new routes of migration to emerge. And on this field, we can turn the MFM, more for more, to MFL, more for less. More funding for less migration coming from their side. So that means that we are ready to fund, but we're waiting for concrete results as far as the number of those leaving Turkish territory and entering, most of the times illegally, or even orchestrated, or even worse, orchestrated to European territory through the territory of my country. So this is more or less what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your openness, Koumoutsakos. Last but not least, now Ken Gottfried, the floor is yours. again, if you would limit yourself to 5 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be speaking to you today. I listened very carefully to the remarks just made by the other two speakers. I very much agree with the fact that the global scene has certainly changed, and changed probably for the worse for the European Union in recent years, and the importance of EU soft power. I like the hardest soft power. It's a nice way of framing things. I would like to think a bit about, so I'm not an expert in migration. I know democracy quite well. I'm also joined by two politicians who will know democracy very well as well. They live it and breathe it. I would like to deal with the issue of authoritarian regimes and what that means for European Union as an external actor. So, if we think about the political dilemmas that were mentioned earlier, I think the important thing to think about from the point of view of democratic governance or democratic values of the European Union, as enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, is what type of regime the EU is actually working with. So what type of regime is its partner? And in many of these instances, these are authoritarian states. And maybe people will be surprised to hear, but between 2013 and 2017, it was about 84% of EU development aid went to non-democracies. So you can see there's very little link between those values and our development aid itself. In the EU budget, it's 0.1% goes to supporting democracy around the world. So you can see maybe from those numbers that normally it doesn't figure too high on the list of priorities. Now, MEP Tobé also mentioned, and I think it's a very important thing to note, the new agreement on the rule of law conditionality within the European Union. I think that, in the context of discussions around that conditionality, there were reports published by the European Commission. There's the whole mechanism linked to the rule of law, where there were both arguments made about the detriment of rule of law backsliding within the EU to European image and European values, let's say, but also really important economic consequences for the internal market and for investment. And, sending money to countries that undermine rule of law sort of compounds the problem even further. And historically, if we look at, I think that places the EU in a different category today, because it's very difficult, I think, for the European Union to justify giving funding to authoritarian states that don't respect the rule of law externally, because its rules dictate internally something very clear today. Now, you can extrapolate that and say that at the same time, lots of these countries around the neighbourhood of the European Union, when it comes to conditionality, have made the case that the imposition of conditionality, here I'm speaking about on democracy or human rights, have said that it's a sort of neo-colonial imposition of European values, right? On the one hand, I find that argument very difficult to defend because the values are universal. People have agreed to these in multiple, international covenants on political and civil rights, international covenants on social and economic rights, UN Declaration of Human Rights, etc., etc. On the other hand, I think it's important to note that some sort of argument to say that it's neo-colonial is really, the fact that there is now imposition of these rules towards European states themselves, their own members, means that argument really falls by the wayside. It's very difficult for these countries to make that sort of argument. Secondly, I think that the issue of conditionality or funding to authoritarian regimes has been justified by the fact that many people make the argument that we should give funding to these countries for other priorities. One of them could be migration, another would be development. Okay, and the one that you tend to see more frequently used is development. And when it comes to development, the argument is that development comes first and democracy or values can come later. Okay, and I think that in the 21st century, we've seen that sort of modernization theory is not correct. Clearly, that doesn't happen all the time. And I think also that sort of argument has two problems. The first of those is that it's possible to support development and democracy at the same time. In the context of the issue of migration, I think that it's very education, health, etc. Okay. Secondly, and I think more importantly for this discussion, there are very clear arguments to be made that supporting authoritarian regimes, funding those authoritarian regimes directly, props up those authoritarian regimes in many instances. And over the long run, I would argue that it undermines, so this is the case when we're talking about budget support, general budget support or sector budget support, most frequently I would say in general budget support. But what it does is it reverses the accountability mechanism. So these governments are not accountable to their citizens for their tax base, but are accountable to external actors for their tax base. And it opens up, obviously, the EU to potential governments engaging in activities that are not acceptable to the European Union, like corruption of funds or human rights abuses that are more likely to occur in authoritarian states which don't have accountable or open systems. So bearing all this in mind, I think that what's important from the point of view of this discussion is that I think the support to authoritarian regimes continues the status quo. And the status quo, if you're going to describe it as a migration phenomenon, I would question whether support to those authoritarian regimes would actually both solve some of the concerns of the European Union and whether it would not just perpetuate the same issues remaining for the foreseeable future. So I think I'll leave it there, but very happy to discuss further some of the other dilemmas and consequences of the dilemmas that you mentioned at the beginning.
Thank you very much. Before I ask some questions from the audience, I want to give you an opportunity inside the panel, so to speak, to see if you want to respond to anything that the other speakers have said. Is there any volunteer, please? I'll give you the floor. If that's not the case, I will ask a question myself. Is it really the case that the EU has accepted that we're not able to change regimes outside of our borders? I guess the answer is that is the case. The only attempts that have been seriously made were done through military means, for example, in Iraq, and it didn't end well. Otherwise, I would posit that we are slowly we have reconciled ourselves to the fact that we cannot create democracies outside our borders. But would you agree, and again ask anybody to volunteer, that we can improve the rule of law outside our borders? We can improve governance. We can certainly improve the living conditions. But is it the case when we do that, when we support those governments, is it the case that we do that at the expense of those governments not working with us on migration? If there's this dilemma, democracy versus migration, I'm thinking about Turkey, for example. You can make the case that the EU could do more to support the rule of law in Turkey. We have asylum seekers from Turkey inside the European Union. If we allowed more irregular migration through Turkey into the European Union, does anybody want to address this?
Well, thank you, and also thank you to the interesting intervention both from MP Koumoutsakos and also from Mr. Godfrey. Well, to answer your question, I mean, for me, it's quite clear that we need to have a very comprehensive approach when it comes to external funding. I mean, for example, supporting democracy and development support, that could also be a way of dealing with the root causes of migration, to be honest. I mean, in that sense, I mean, you cannot kind of separate them too much. But I also would like to mention, because this is very common, but when you're talking about the development assistance, of course, sometimes money is really important for several of our partner countries. But to be honest, sometimes it's not the funding that will be the big question when it comes to the question on conditionality. And for example, when you have the discussion about migration, many times I think it can be more about the incentives or sometimes taking away incentives. And what I'm talking is, for example, to have a discussion with a country where you perhaps say that we can open up for more visas for your businesses, or we could actually take away opportunities for your business. That is for me, when I talk about conditionality, when I talk about that Commission now we have a new instrument with the NDICI, a lot of money that we want to use in an efficient and proper way to deal with the different objectives that we have. But we sometimes need to have, of course, the best thing is that we can build it on a partnership, and also try, of course, sometimes to build a partnership also with regimes that we find problematic. Because in the long term, you think it might cause a better situation. But sometimes it's clear that our aid also must be focused to different channels. Sometimes it's quite clear that we should not work as closely as we do with the government. And there we need to go more into the civil society. We need to work more with the local region, and the local authorities could be a solution sometimes. Basically, what I'm trying to say that I think that we need to be flexible, because as MP Koumoutsakos said, we really are a big, hard, soft power. This is an opportunity for the European Union. And I'm not one that are arguing that we should step down. I would actually say that we need to step forward, because what we're seeing in Africa, for example, is that, for example, China is taking a much larger role in Africa, for example. And for me, it is quite clear that China does not have the same objective as we have in the European Union when it comes to combat climate change, for example, when it comes to many of the questions of democracy and human rights. And there, of course, we have our role to play. But at the same time, there are other questions where we need to have a serious discussion with our counterparts, and that is sometimes on the question of migration. So my answer is basically we need a comprehensive and very flexible approach. That is the only way to deal with it.
Mr. Koumoutsakos first, and then...
I'll be very brief, because I can fully subscribe to what has been said by Thomas. Conditionality and flexibility should go hand in hand. We need prerequisites, requirements, and of course we need flexibility on how to channel our economic development aid or assistance to countries with authoritarian regimes. I just want to add an element that I think it can be taken seriously into consideration, which is the very presence of the EU in such countries is by itself an element that facilitates respect for human rights, democracy, social sensitivities, and probably in itself it might be a factor, a catalyst that weakens the power of an authoritarian regime. So, if you channel flexibly your development assistance under specific conditionality, and at the same time you have a presence in the country, I think that this is a recipe for success. That means the success of us exporting our democratic values and principles. In any case, it takes time. It cannot be done from one day to another. That's why persistence, patience, and perseverance are keywords in implementing through economic development assistance, implementing an external policy that has as a main objective to promote democracy abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. Now can go through, please.
Yeah, so I'll try and be brief. I very much agree with what MEP Tobe said about the mechanism that is used. So I think that that's a really important point. And I think my point is that in contexts where governments are guilty of very sort of egregious human rights abuses, there should not be funding going to those governments. There can be cooperation. We must work with those governments for sure on multiple different priorities, but we shouldn't be funding them. And that's the basis of the rule of law mechanism as well within the European Union. Maybe one thing to add in relation to your question at the beginning, I think that, and that you've alluded to, I think that to make the sort of dilemma of the fact that we're supporting authoritarian regimes in order to save democracy within the European Union, I think it has a grain of truth, but I also don't think it holds up to fact, because I believe that the sort of deterioration, this slow autocratization that we've seen around the world very much predates the sort of wave of migration to the European Union. So it definitely comes from before, and the examples of sort of democratic backsliding around the world are not really linked to migration in many instances. You know, Brazil, Philippines, Georgia, Thailand, it's not really linked. And secondly, I think that there are some assumptions that we need to make about our support to authoritarian governments. We need to make the assumption that that support actually means that people do not migrate. I think that that is an assumption that we don't have strong basis in fact to say that that is true. Whereas it's much easier for us to say that supporting authoritarian government undermines democracy within that country. You know, maybe it's not, our objective is not to say that this country must be democratic in 1 year or 2 years, but it should be a long-term priority. I think it's in the interest of the European Union over the long run for those countries to be democratic. So I think that's what I say in the context of some assumptions that we would have to make in that dilemma.
Interesting, thank you. I will now turn to our audience. Let me take one or two questions. Give me a second, I will read them from my screen. Let me ask you this question. I would like to ask your thoughts of gender-responsive policies in the EU regarding migration in connection with all other policies that impact women's lives, such as trade, finances, development, human rights, and the like. So any thoughts on gender-responsive policies in the context of what we have been talking about? Thomas Tobe.
Okay. Thank you. I hope that I fully understand the question. I would like to give two comments. Firstly, a general comment when it comes to efficiency of development assistance. It is quite interesting, but if you look at the data, it is very clear, for example, that if you're working with gender equality, that might be one of the most efficient way to deal with development assistance. There are numerous examples of this. And that is also something that I think it is important for us to take in now with the new instrument NDICI. That is not, this is not only about a European value, about equality. It is actually also very efficient if you want to use EU funding in a way that actually gives support and gives long-term effects. When it comes to the migration question and linked to gender, Of course, it is quite clear that we have seen that since we have many refugees coming to Europe still on very dangerous trips over the sea, that we do not at the same time create an environment and a migration policy that is focused towards women and children. It is quite clear that many times the decision is very often that young men will take the decision, and that will be the decision of also perhaps the family, to be the one that will try to seek asylum in Europe. And of course, for me, it's just basically outlining what I said in my introduction. We have to remember that most refugees will never set their foot on European soil. That is the truth. And we need to find, from my point of view, we need to find a more orderly way to deal with migration, to find legal pathways where people do not have to travel on dangerous trips, funding smugglers to find their asylum right in Europe. That is something that needs to change. And that is also the way that we actually can change that we have a difference when it comes to gender on migration. I know that this is a very sensitive topic, but I think that it's quite clear that we have to talk about it because this is the reality. And of course, we need to make sure that we can give more help, I would say, in the neighboring countries where we have people that for different reasons have migrated. We need more help in the neighboring countries, in the regional countries, but of course also in the same way, there are people that need protection, in Europe. And of course, we should not give advantage to the one that actually have the opportunity or the possibility to make their way to European soil.
Thank you very much. I will now ask two other questions. One is about the new pact on migration. The question is as follows: how effective can the new pact be, since, as it seems, responsibility is compulsory for the border states, but solidarity from other EU members is practically voluntary? This takes us a bit away from the focus of this debate, but I think it's okay. It's a relevant question. Anybody who wish to answer that? Mr. Koumoutsakos?
Probably it's not a surprise that I'm asking to answer this question, since I will be dealing with the negotiations and the deliberations at the European level regarding the new Migration and Asylum Pact. This is a very fundamental question. We should, since we are talking about a holistic European migration asylum policy, we cannot but strike the right balance between the responsibility of the frontline countries, that are the countries who are fatally have to deal mainly with the waves of the migratory waves, and the solidarity that the other member states need to show. This is a fair request from the frontline countries. Because, as I said in my initial intervention, Europe in itself is a huge pull factor for migration. Those people arriving in our shores want to go, because this is their destination, to go to Germany, to France, to the Netherlands. So as frontline countries, we are dealing with those people arriving in our territory, but people who want to go in the North European partners. So only this mere fact shows that we need to share the burden in a fair way. And I think that despite the fact that striking this balance is very difficult, and I understand this. We need to work relentlessly in trying to find the necessary balance between compulsory responsibility and effective solidarity. The fair burden sharing of migration should be a key concern and a key element of the new European migration policy. We have created a group of a 5-member countries group, like-minded groups of the frontline countries. And what we are asking for is this solidarity, particularly when it comes to migration crisis with which we will have to deal with. Because our countries, and I'm talking now about my country specifically, we are neighboring regions that produces crisis, that they produce crisis, frictions, tensions, climate problems. So I would say that the normal in our region is the crisis. That's why we ask our European partners to accept the fact that we need an effective migration crisis, an effective mechanism for dealing with migration crisis. A mechanism that will be triggered easily, without cumbersome procedures, without delay, so that the frontline countries feel reassured that when it is needed, this mechanism of distribution of the burden and expand solidarity will be put into function easily and on time and in time. So these are some very fundamental thoughts that I would like to share with our audience regarding this necessary balance between responsibility in the borders and solidarity in the other member states. And one of the principles that we were having, and we are going to repeat in this negotiation process on the Migration Pact, from our side, from the frontline members and country side, is nothing can be compulsory if everything is not compulsory. So nothing can be compulsory without everything being compulsory. Compulsory responsibility, compulsory solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask about Turkey again, and I'll leave it for the panelists to volunteer. We are now at a stage where funding under the existing scheme is running out. The 6 billion euros has been committed, not all paid, but all committed to projects now. We're at a stage where Turkey has been making a lot of noise on the European and international scene, accompanied by aggressive actions in East Mediterranean. Yet, as we glean from this discussion, the European Union has to work with Turkey, at least with regards to migration. How do you see the future of this cooperation? There is now a talk of a renewed deal, perhaps, or a prolongation of the existing deal, where one could argue conditionality has worked, more or less, until March last year. Turkey has been holding up its end of its bargain, preventing smuggling. That has all changed in March, but now we're back to more or less the situation where irregular migration is relatively low, although it does continue. So how do you see the future of this cooperation? And we have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody would like to take this up. Okay, Mr. Koumoutsakos, 1 minute, please. And then
even shorter. We need to have an effective cooperation with Turkey. This cooperation must be based on the fact that they have their own problems, which we need to admit, because it's a huge challenge that they are dealing with. But they have to accept as well that we are there to help them in order to help us. That's why I mentioned the conditionality for the funding, based on the more for less, more funding for less migration flows towards Europe. They can do it. They can control the smugglers' networks. They have the means, the people and the services to control the smuggling business, and they need to be much more effective than they are right now. I think if we focus on this element, the results will be spectacularly positive. We don't need to open a huge philosophical debate on how we are going to cooperate with Turkey. They need our support, funding support, or know-how support. We need their effectiveness on controlling and eradicating the smugglers, the smuggling network. And the final point, we need to revisit both the EU-Turkey agreement of 2016 so that we adapted to today's conditions, and we should as well start once again discussing seriously what we are going to do with the agreement that we had with Turkey as Europe in 2014, the readmission agreement, EU-Turkey readmission agreement, which has not been implemented due to Turkey's refusal to implement it, deny to implement it. So the bottom comment is that we need more open, concrete and clear-cut discussion with Turkey on a very cooperative basis, but all players should abide by their commitments and obligations.
Thank you. One last very brief remark. If you can, you raise your hand. You're welcome. You're okay? Okay. In that case, I would like to thank all of you, our speakers. It was a really interesting discussion. I'm sorry we have to keep it so short. This would really merit a much longer discussion. I myself have thousands of questions. Unfortunately, we're going to go into them. I apologize to those of our viewers whose questions were not answered, but the time is limited. I can assure everybody that this event was recorded and it is going to be available on the YouTube channel of the Martin Center as well as on our Facebook page. Thank you very much, our speakers. We hope to do similar things, do similar events with you in the future, and we hope to cooperate with you on different levels as well. Thanks very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.